Hey everyone, I am Isaac Saul and this is Tangle. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to be talking about Ashton Kutcher, the actor, venture capitalist, and activist who, along with his wife, Mila Kunis, is in the news after writing a character letter on behalf of Danny Masterson, their co-star from that 70s show, who was just sentenced to 30 years to life in prison for drugging and raping two women. Unlike our normal videos today, I am not going to be sharing a bunch of opinions from the left and the right and then my take. This one is personal, and to that end, I need to start with a bit of a disclosure. Ashton Kutcher hired me in 2015 to help start a company called A+, a since sunsetted media company that was focused on what we called solutions journalism, effectively a feel-good news website that did actual reporting. I worked there for 6 years as a reporter, a columnist, and an editor, running the politics vertical and several other projects before I eventually left to start this project, Tangle, full-time. Kutcher's involvement ended before I left, and it appears that the company briefly transitioned into video news before shutting down. From my working experience with him, I know Ashton to be smart, kind, empathetic. He was a great boss, a dreamer, and as far as I can tell from both what I saw in person and read about him in the news, he dedicates a significant amount of his resources and energy towards doing things he thinks are going to be good for the world or profitable, and often both. He represents a lot of things about America that I love, which is to say my perspective on him here is completely skewed and corrupted. That's also why many reporters avoid writing or talking about people they know or have personal relationships with. With all that said, though, I decided to do this video because I think I'm actually well positioned to. I think my corrupted and skewed perspective on Ashton has allowed me to see something many other people are apparently missing about the character letters he and Mila Kunis wrote. Given my relationship with Ashton, I want to be clear that this is not meant to be one of those standard videos where I share a wide range of opinions on an issue and then my own perspective. This is not an act of journalism. This is an opinion piece coming from me personally about a perspective that I think should be put down and shared because it is a perspective I didn't see anywhere else and one that I think is pretty important. So to say that the news of Ashton and Mila's character letters did not go over well would be the understatement of the week. Here are a few choice things being said about them on the internet right now. My contention is that while there is a great deal of justified criticism for Ashton and Mila's words, which we're going to talk about, there has also been a tremendous amount of character assassination and misleading writing about their letters, and perhaps most importantly, a complete and total disregard for the purpose or a discussion about character letters and more lenient sentences in the first place. My perspective is one that does not rely on believing Ashton is a good person. You can think he is awful or awful adjacent, as many people do, and I hope you can still see the rationale of his actions. So I'd like to defend that rationale here. Let me start with something important. Danny Masterson is a rapist. The evidence against him, which was presented in court, seems both overwhelming and decisive. There are multiple victims who told uncannily similar stories and a long trail of accusations to boot. The victims and their lawyers convinced a jury of Masterson's peers of his guilt, and after reading about the case, I have no reason to question the verdict. I believe he's guilty of horrendous crimes and that Masterson, backed by the Church of Scientology, tried to silence and smear the victims. 3 accusers shared powerful victim impact statements of being unable to sleep next to their partners, hold relationships, or even maintain the will to live. Some spoke about the way in which the church silenced them. Here are a few excerpts from those statements, which I find incredibly important to read. The first is from Jane Doe number 3. When you're raped, she said, it's not your surface that's the most defiled. It damages you on a cellular level. I honestly still don't even have the words to properly describe what being raped does to you. I just know the symptoms. I've suffered insomnia. I would oftentimes stay awake for 24-hour periods. I hate the dark. I cannot sleep next to anyone, not even my husband, my sweet husband. I don't know what I did to deserve such a good and decent and gentle man, always patient and never questioning. He's never, in 14 years of marriage, ever made me think he would harm me in any way, yet I cannot sleep in bed next to him. I harm myself in my sleep. I regularly wake up with deep bruises and scratches on my hands and arms. In 2017, I punched a hole in the wall behind my bed during my sleep. I'm always fighting monsters. In 2016, after finding out I wasn't the only victim, I had my first panic attack. I went to the emergency room because I thought I was dying. Here's a statement from Jane Doe number 2. Do not confuse it. Even though it was so long ago, what you, Masterson, did to me by emotionally, mentally, and physically injuring me in this brutal manner still reverberates and lives on in my body as corporal pain. The body is a relentless witness. I still have to contend with what you did to me that night in ways that take a life's work of therapy to repair, because every time I think I'm okay, that rape comes back to throw that night around me as actual physical pain, to say, "Hi, Miesha, you're not done with me yet." When you raped me, you stole from me. That is what rape is, a theft of the spirit. You disfigured my life. You stole some crucial piece of my self-worth and lessened my capacity for joy. You made every part of me turn on myself. And finally, here's a statement from Jane Doe number 1. I also recall the last time I heard from my mother and what her last words to me were. It was February 2020. She texted me and told me to never contact her again. She had warned me ahead of time. She wanted to see Danny Masterson brought to justice for raping me, but not at the expense of her religion, their religion, Scientology. She explained clearly in text that she was coordinating with her Scientology handlers and their legal department, and she would happily cooperate and testify here in this court, but Scientology was not to be dragged into it. She had firm rules, and I had to choose between cooperating fully with law enforcement and the courts or shielding Scientology and keeping my mother in my life. So, to be clear, the impact of Masterson's crime was immense and unspeakable. It is justified that he is going to prison. Before Masterson's sentencing, more than 50 people wrote letters to the judge on his behalf. Among those people were Kutcher and Kunis. Their letters were very similar, though different in some parts. In nearly every article or social media post I've read or seen about Kutcher and Kunis' letters, they've been snipped and cut by the press. So, for the purposes of discussing it, I've decided to read the entirety of Kutcher's letter here in full. It begins like this. Honorable Judge Olmedo, my name is Ashton Kutcher. I am an actor, investor, philanthropist, and most importantly, a father. I met Danny Masterson when he was 20 years old in 1998. He instantly became a friend, dedicated coworker, and role model to me, and has remained as such for 25 years. As a friend, Danny has been nothing but a positive influence on me. He's an extraordinarily honest and intentional human being. Over a 25-year relationship, I don't ever recall him lying to me. He's taught me about being direct and confronting issues in life and relationships head-on, resolving them, and moving forward. Danny is a person that is consistently there for you when you need him. We've traveled around the world together, raised our daughters together, and shared countless family moments. Not only is he a good friend to me, but I've witnessed him be a good friend to others, and the kind of brother others would be lucky to have. As a role model, Danny has consistently been an excellent one. I attribute not falling into the typical Hollywood life of drugs directly to Danny. Anytime that we were to meet someone or interact with someone who is on drugs or did drugs, he made it clear that he wouldn't be a good person to be friends with. And for me, that was an implication that if I were to do drugs, he wouldn't want to be friends with me, which is something I never would want to risk or jeopardize. I'm grateful to him for that positive peer pressure. He also set an extraordinary standard around how you treat other people. There was an incident where we were at a pizza parlor and a belligerent man entered who was berating his girlfriend. We had never met or seen these people before, but Danny was the first person to jump to the defense of this girl. It was an incident he didn't have to get involved in, but proactively chose to because the way this man was behaving was not right. He has always treated people with decency, equality, and generosity. After 9/11, Danny was a huge advocate for support of the firefighters affected by the event, rallying his friends and coworkers to pitch in however they could. Danny had his daughter a year before I had mine. He's had a standard of being a hands-on dad. We have spent countless hours together with our kids, and he is among a few people that I would trust to be alone with my son and daughter. He's also a dedicated and loyal husband with unwavering commitment to his wife. We have spent hundreds of hours working together. Danny takes his job seriously. He is kind, courteous, and hardworking. He treated everyone from the grips to the teamsters to the actors to the caterers as equal. He showed up on time all the time and always pulled his weight. We have also traveled around the world together promoting our work. I can honestly say that no matter where we were or who we were with, I never saw my friend be anything other than the guy I have described. While I'm aware that the judgment has been cast as guilty on 2 counts of rape by force and the victims have a great desire for justice, I hope that my testament to his character is taken into consideration in sentencing. I do not believe he is an ongoing harm to society, and having his daughter raised without a present father would be a tertiary injustice in and of itself. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Best, Ashton Kutcher. So let me start by saying that this letter is tough to read, and I had a hard time processing it the first time I read it. I imagine any sexual assault survivor, and especially Masterson's victims, would have a hard time getting through it too. Many interpreted the letter as advocating for Masterson's innocence, which I can understand. For instance, Kutcher says Masterson always treated people with decency, equality, and generosity, which is something that cannot coexist with Masterson drugging and raping multiple women, or abusing his girlfriend when she refused to have sex with him. There's also the emphasis on Masterson's anti-drug attitude, which seems particularly tone-deaf in a trial where he just got convicted of drugging and raping women. Even tactically, it may have been a blunder. Some legal experts noted how little space in the letter was spent on the impact this sentence would have on Masterson's family compared to just his personality traits. The former is something a judge is more likely to consider in reducing a sentence. At the absolute bare minimum, given some of those oversights and a few grammatical errors in the draft of the letter that I saw, one can conclude that this letter was not written carefully, despite addressing an extremely sensitive topic. At the same time, though, I also think Kutcher and Kunis explicitly noted their understanding that a judgment had been made, that the victims want justice, and that they were simply advocating for a lesser sentence. And if it seems like Kutcher is advocating for a lesser sentence for a rapist, that's because he is. The purpose of these letters is to make the case for a more lenient judgment, even while acknowledging the perpetrator's guilt. For instance, Kutcher says he understands the victims have a great desire for justice and that Masterson is not an ongoing harm to society, which implies that he had been a harm in the past. Cynically, you could argue their acknowledgement of the verdict and the victims was little more than a public relations trick, but interpreting their words in charitable or uncharitable ways is unnecessary when we can just take their writing at face value. Kutcher and Kunis make it clear. The judgment has been cast, they don't dispute the verdict, they've seen Masterson act consistently in high character ways, they don't think he's a continued threat to society, and they hope for his family's sake his sentence is less than 30 years in prison. And this is where I think my view starts to diverge from many people in the public who I've seen discussing this issue. Character letters are a fundamentally good part of the justice system. Every day, judges and juries decide the fate of the accused and convicted criminals whom they know only in the context of their purported crimes. Character letters are an opportunity for all participants in the judicial system to hear from people who know the accused or convicted personally and to consider their personal traits when adjudicating a punishment. To make this simple, a person convicted of robbing a cashier who has 50 character letters describing him as a great father who is desperately trying to make ends meet might justifiably receive a shorter sentence than a person who robbed a cashier to pay off a gambling debt and was an abusive father and partner at home. I prefer a justice system that considers these personal letters, and I prefer a judge who welcomes them with an open mind. We all should. And if you hold that principle, then it's important to try to hold it consistently. Kutcher and Kunis participating in this process for someone who, by all accounts, is one of their closest friends should not be surprising or condemnable. Some writers, like MSNBC's Noor Noman, have argued that because Masterson's crimes were awful and premeditated, any character letter emphasizing his goodness outside of the crime should be irrelevant. I couldn't disagree more. Humans are complex, and criminals, even rapists, are human. It is my view that we shouldn't define people solely by their worst actions, which is a position that becomes increasingly difficult the worse that action is. By accounting for the complexity of a criminal, how to dispense justice and how to punish someone should not get simpler the more horrendous the crime is. It should make the process harder. This reality that people who commit heinous crimes should retain their humanity after their actions make them criminals is one of the greatest challenges for delivering justice. I can't say for sure how I'd handle a similar situation, but I can think of at least a handful of friends and family members whom, even if they committed horrible crimes like the one Masterson has been convicted of, I would at least consider vouching for in a letter asking to lessen their sentence. That is especially true if they had children at home, or if I thought they could be rehabilitated, or if I struggled to reconcile the verdict with the person that I knew. Which brings me to another under-discussed element here, the sentence. We generally put people in prison for a few reasons: to deter crime, to keep society safe from immediate threats, to rehabilitate criminals, and to deliver justice for victims. Delivering justice for victims is a subjective thing. How long in prison is enough time to make a victim feel like their story and experience has been accounted for? How long is enough for a rape victim? I can certainly get behind the idea that a decades to life sentence is appropriate, given the impact Masterson had on his victims. But it might surprise you to know that there is evidence suggesting that compared to juries or the public, victims often want less harsh sentences and emphasize rehabilitation over punishment. There is also evidence victims can be more punitive. It's a very complicated thing. I also think another thing is true. This sentence isn't an effective way to keep society safe, nor is it an effective way to deter future crime or rehabilitate a criminal. Masterson was sentenced to 30 years to life. So far, I've only seen one writer react to this sentence's length in an intellectually honest but emotionally fraught way, and it was Eric Levitz in New York Magazine. Levitz made this argument better than I could, so I'll quote heavily from what he wrote here. Quote, "There is no inherent contradiction between concern for the victims of sexual violence and opposition to exceptionally long prison sentences for rapists. According to an analysis from the Council on Criminal Justice between 1980 and 2000, the average imposed sentence for homicide in the United States was more than twice as long as in the Netherlands or Sweden. The average imposed sentence for rape was 5 times longer in the US than it was in either of those European countries. It is possible for a person to simultaneously believe that rape is a heinous and under-prosecuted crime and that America should not impose much longer prison sentences on violent offenders than social democratic nations do." Later, Levitz gets into the heart of the issue. Long sentences are neither necessary for nor particularly effective at deterrence. The criminological literature indicates that increasing sentence length does not reduce crime. What matters for deterrence is the certainty of apprehension, not the severity of punishment. This makes intuitive sense. Before an individual commits a crime, they are liable to consider their likelihood of escaping all consequences. It is not unusual for a burglar to look around for witnesses or nearby police before proceeding with a break-in. Therefore, if we are concerned with deterring rape, our focus should be on increasing the certainty of apprehension by ending the outrageous epidemic of untested rape kits, investing more resources into the investigation of sexual violence, and increasing support for victims so as to enable everyone who wishes to come forward to do so. In countries like Sweden, where the average person convicted of rape serves a single year in prison, reoffense rates are much lower than those in the United States. I would definitely not support a short 1-year sentence in prison for a criminal like Masterson, but I suspect somewhere over that very low bar and under 30 years in prison is probably the right balance of rehabilitation and justice for the victims. All this is to say, if you are interested in protecting victims of sexual assault, punishing criminals, potentially rehabilitating them, and preventing future crime, you don't necessarily need a prison sentence of 30 years to life, especially not when you're sending someone to an American prison where rehabilitative programs are lacking and criminals often become more violent. However uncomfortable it is emotionally, this reality offers even more justification for the character letters to advocate for lesser sentences and for Kutcher and Kunis to advocate on behalf of their friend. Much of this research relates directly to what I've called my most extreme political view, which I've shared in the past. Prisons don't work in the United States, and we need to drastically change how they function and what we use them for. That's a somewhat tangential argument, and it's one I've already made at length, but it's directly relevant to the purpose and necessity of something like a character letter, which can be used to reduce someone's time in prison. Obviously, these character letters caused quite a bit of backlash, so Kutcher and Kunis eventually released a video in response to that backlash.
We are aware of the pain that has been caused by the character letters that we wrote on behalf of Danny Masterson.
We support victims. We have done this historically through our work and will continue to do so in the future.
A couple months ago, Danny's family reached out to us and they asked us to write character letters to represent the person that we knew for 25 years so that the judge could take that into full consideration relative to the sentencing.
The letters were not written to question the legitimacy of the judicial system or the validity of the jury's ruling.
They were intended for the judge to read and not to undermine the testimony of the victims or re-traumatize them in any way. We would never want to do that. And we're sorry if that has taken place.
Our heart goes out to every single person who's ever been a victim of sexual assault, sexual abuse, or rape.
In some ways, I thought that video was actually worse than their initial letters that started the controversy. As journalist Yashar Ali said, it had some heavily lawyered language. He also suggested there contained some Scientological phrasing. I can't vouch for the latter. I've never seen anything to credibly link Kunis and Kutcher to Scientology, nor did I ever hear Kutcher or anyone around him discuss it. But I agree. The video had heavily lawyered language and some insensitive parts. The sentiment was fine, but the worst part is what they don't say explicitly, that they believe the victims' stories, or that they understand Masterson is guilty as charged. Given the context of the criticism they were facing and how much of it they didn't address directly, I happen to think that this apology video did more to undermine the victims than anything that was said in the letters, which, as they rightly noted, were intended expressly for the judge as a way to consider sentencing, not as a judgment on the trial. I want to admit something here, that publishing this video makes me extremely nervous. Not just because I'm writing as someone with a connection to the subject of the story, but because I'm afraid of being cast on the wrong side of a dog pile on a convicted rapist and his purported enablers. But saying things that are scary and feel true is usually a sign that you're writing something that's worth publishing, and so I'm trying to lean into that feeling here. All that being said, I do want to make a few points clear by reiterating them in simple terms. It is obvious to me that Danny Masterson is guilty of horrific crimes, and the victims are all telling the truth. I believe he should go to jail for many years. I do not think that a 30-year sentence rather than a 25-year or even a 15-year sentence makes us any safer, nor will it prevent more crimes like the ones he committed from happening in the future. I think the discussion of what kind of response is just and appropriate is a reasonable one and an important dialogue to have. I believe character letters are a good and necessary part of the justice system, and I do not think the basic fact that Kutcher and Kunis wrote a letter vouching for Masterson was a condemnable act. I also believe that victim impact statements are a good and necessary part of the justice system, and any consideration of the character letters should obviously be weighed against those impact statements. I think the language in Ashton and Mila's letters and their video left plenty of room for criticism. But there is a difference between criticizing how they made their statements and for making those statements at all. There's a difference between accusing them of being insensitive and thoughtless with their language and excoriating them as rape enablers or worse. Sometimes, in today's political landscape, people take principled views that seem to evaporate when it becomes inconvenient. Unfortunately, this story quickly turned into a sterling example of that too. Many people on the left who regularly advocate for criminal justice reform, open-mindedness, fewer people in prison, empathy-first politics, and more complexity when considering how to punish criminals, suddenly turned into pro-prison hawks the moment these letters were released. Simultaneously, a lot of folks on the right who regularly criticize the woke mob view online character assassinations and cancel culture as a grave national threat, and who believe the woke Hollywood lib elites are destroying the nuclear family seem perfectly happy to blithely label someone a pedophile or a sex offender or a creep for writing a letter that argued in part that a convicted criminal's family would be better off if he didn't spend the next 3 decades in prison. Every day, I write and talk about partisan politics and how the left and right disagree. In this case, so many people on both sides of the aisle really do agree about the heinousness of sexual violence. But as much as we all truly care about stopping sexual exploitation of all kinds, we tend to ignore the evidence we have on how to better prevent these things and instead put our emotions on the issue front and center. All of these discussions are fraught with complexity and emotion. They are not easy to talk or write about, but engaging in this kind of dialogue in good faith is necessary. I think, at the very least, we should be able to hold a disdain for Masterson's actions and an understanding of people like Kutcher and Kunis at the same time. We should be able to do that without belittling or lessening the experience of the victims. All right, everyone, that is it for today's video. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Before we get out of here, I want to know what you think. So let us know in the comments. We'll be keeping an eye on them and hopefully address them in next week's video, which I suspect will be back to our normal format. We'll see you guys next week. Peace.